Hello and welcome to another Citizens Panel by Debating Europe. My name is Joe Litobarski. I'm the editor-in-chief of Debating Europe, and we are discussing the future of multilateralism, what the post-pandemic world order should look like. I'm here with a panel of citizens, and we're going to discuss lots of different topics. It's a big kind of issue that we're kind of tackling with here, but hopefully we'll kind of break it down, and they'll bring in some ideas and what they would like to focus on. So we'll start with introductions, a round of introductions. I'll go round clockwise as I see you on my screen. So we'll start with Karla. Do you want to just introduce yourself, and then we'll go round?
Of course. Hello, everyone. My name is Karla Alvarado from Mexico City. I hold a master's degree in international relations, and I'm really glad to share with you this conversation. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you, Karla. It's good to have you with us. Diogo, you're next. What do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, everyone. So I'm Diogo. I come originally from Portugal. I have done a bachelor's in economics, and currently I'm studying at Leiden University. Pursuing a master's in political science, and really looking forward to this conversation. And thanks for having me.
Thank you, Diogo. And Rita, would you like to give us an introduction?
Yes, of course. Hello, everyone, and it's nice to be here. I'm Rita Antunes. I'm also Portuguese. I am taking a master's in pharmaceutical sciences, and currently I'm Secretary General of June Enterprises Europe. It's an European organization. So I have like two different perspectives here that I would like to bring today, and I'm looking forward for this discussion.
Perfect. And I think I should have checked this before we start recording. Apologies. Am I pronouncing your name correctly when I say Rita? Is that correct, or is it Rita?
Yeah, I say it's Rita, but it's
Rita.
nice to say Rita. It's not a problem.
Okay, well, I'm going to try Rita. Okay, because I'm living in the Netherlands, so I've got the Dutch glottal sound, the kind of h, so I'll try to use that if I can. But thank you very much. Okay, welcome. Okay, let's kick off the discussion then. We'll start it really at high level, and then we'll get into more details as we go. So the first question I'll put to each of you. I'll start with Karla, and we'll go around in the same order. We've just come through a pandemic together, okay? All of us, we've experienced it in different ways, but it's hit at and this I'm sure will come up in the discussion, and we have very much experienced it in different ways, and different countries have been affected differently. But it does feel like there are all these, the pandemic has maybe accelerated some trends that were happening anyway. And there's a lot of conversations happening about what the world should look like in 2030 and 2050 as we go forwards, with given climate change, given some of the demographic pressures, technology, all these different changes, as we at least in the West, maybe not everywhere, but at least in the West, exit the pandemic through vaccinations and through all the herd immunity and whatever it is. As we start to exit the pandemic, what should the world look like? What do you think that the post-pandemic world should look like? What are you going to kind of bring to the conversation, Karla?
Well, it is really interesting to see this situation currently, because first of all, we don't know when we can consider the pandemic is done. We have been seeing several variants, so it is increasing the different crises we are facing right now. So in terms of how I can imagine the world, maybe not in terms of perspective, but more like considering the reality right now, is not a really integrated world as probably we would like to. As we probably know, multilateralism has been in crisis since several decades ago. It is not something that the pandemic brought. But it is really interesting to me to see how economic regionalism is now possibly one of the answers to cope with the crisis, not only in terms of sanity, but also economics, politics, and society. So what this crisis is showing us is that in the future, the world will be so much more connected in so many levels as we can see now. And this is not only a world seen and dictated by states, but also by society. I see that the world or the role of society has been more evident with social media and other resources that now show how important collectivity is for creating new things and to create solutions as well. So we are not regarding or only relying on the government to find solutions for everyone. On the opposite, society is bringing those solutions. So in the 1930, for example, or 1950, I don't think things will be extremely different, because actors like China, who is like the treat for the world for so many people and organizations, they have their own long-term plans. So we should look at those plans and maybe understand their foreign policies, not only of China, but the different countries, to understand what's going on and what they are expecting to come in the future, in the near future, and also in the long-term future. So in brief, to give the word to my colleagues, I think, as I said, it will not look totally different, but no so drastically, how could I say, done. I'm meaning that the world will not end in 2 decades or 3. We have a brilliant future if we want to, and that's why I think multilateralism is important, but it's also important to determine which kind of multilateralism we need now. Who should dictate it or establish it? That is not only the rich countries, but it should be a comprehensive multilateralism that understands the necessities of all countries in all continents, and that should be also considering gender equality and all the different realities that are coexisting in the whole world.
Thank you, Karla. That was a really rich way to start the debate. I'm so glad you brought, I mean, there's so much that you've brought to the table there. The idea of multilateralism versus economic regionalism. We talk a lot in Europe about strategic autonomy. This is this buzzword which is using, and clearly we've seen with supply chains coming under pressure during the pandemic, and this kind of drive to shorten supply chains, or kind of to focus on regions, as you say. And indeed, there are maybe environmental pressures which are encouraging that. You know, we're often told to kind of buy locally, or to kind of eat local produce and seasonal produce rather than shipping it around the world. So this is really, really interesting. And the other thing is, of course, the proliferation of different actors beyond just states, and the kind of impact that they will have, not just in institutions like the multilateral institutions like the United Nations and so on, but as you say, kind of civil society. I mean, look at what's happening in Ottawa at the moment with truckers kind of shutting down a city, right? I mean, I think that the kind of, these questions about connectivity and collective action and so on are really interesting on the global stage. And I like that you ended on a very optimistic note as well. I think that's important, some optimism. Let's not have it all doom and gloom. Diogo, what do you want to bring to the conversation? What do you think, or what do you hope the world looks like in 2030 and in 2050?
Right. So I'm really sorry to cut it down though, but I really think on the beginning we should probably as well understand a little bit why we are here in this situation as well, and what caused this that the pandemic in the end reinforced. So I just thought I would brief in as well with some also economic predictions, which are also coming from a really pessimistic economist, which says that indeed not only economically but also demographically, also in society, the EU in specific is really going to lose a lot of predominance in the ruling of the world per se, because other agents, mainly in South and East Asia, are growing as well. And I think that the pandemic, and even if we shift it also to other regions in the world, and also the vaccination rollouts and the percentage of people vaccinated, we see that indeed there are some inequalities that are still visible and still need to be changed. So it will be really hard as well, like having especially a multi-polar world to have the incentives as well for the big powers, the US, China, and as well India growing, to also take part in this solution, because that in a way, and this has been kind of also something that has been debatable, has been the Western liberal order, is it going to be ended? Doesn't mean that the world will be coming to an end, but it's actually a really it can be pessimistic in a way, but it can be realistic to another way, to another sense. It cannot actually lead to some ideas as well for us for reflection, especially I would say for the EU, because like we are having really a lot of issues as well, and not only in different topics and stuff. So I think it's also really important for us to draw conclusions from what we are seeing, and also try to find ways as well to tackle these problems. And it has been mentioned, for instance, climate change. I think the EU could be a pillar in some of the key aspects of society that needs to be changed. And we youth, so we mentioned the society, that would be important that the society tackles these issues. So I think it will actually be important that the EU, for instance, and here I'm focusing on, I guess, my close reality, that we take on the lead as well into the change for this topic. So that we also promote, because the EU is a really privileged place for multilateralism. So I could definitely see this as well happening, even though the EU is still on the kind of identity crisis. That it's something we can also talk about. But yeah, I mean, despite the more pessimistic forecast that may be happening, I still think that there's a way for multilateralism to work. Actually, with what Karla was saying about the regionalism, I think it's actually something that it's growing, in different blocks. But we need to make sure that this regionalism also shifts and creates conditions for these different blocks to cooperate and not just lead themselves to their own interest in the end. So, well, I think it's really important to also sustain the pillars and what we want to change basically in society, in society itself. Sorry for the repetition, but also in youth. And the change really begins with us. And I mean, we are ultimately the people that can make pressure on not only governments but also other actors that are also important in this whole sphere to change as well.
That is fascinating. Thank you, Diogo. That, to me, one of the things that struck me. So first of all, you clearly take are kind of very aware of risks, and there's certainly, you said pessimistic, a more pessimistic approach. You also talked about the end of the Western liberal order. And I think this is sort of implicit in this entire conversation that we're having, which is, however you want to structure it or describe it, it could be US hegemony, it could be the Western liberal order, whatever you want to call it, it feels like something is ending. And there's opportunity in that. There's a potential for real positive change, as Karla said, but there could be risks. If we look in the past at times when global orders have changed, there have clearly been some risks. You look at the rise of Germany in the 20th century, for example, with the First World War. There have been times when kind of rising powers have challenged a kind of a great power or a kind of hegemon, and it has led to kind of catastrophe. So clearly we want to avoid that. This is not good. Can we have the more optimistic future that Karla's talking about, the kind of positive vision? Can we avoid the pessimism and kind of And you said, Diogo, interestingly, you think perhaps the EU has a role to play in this, in promoting kind of these regional blocks that Karla's talking about, cooperating together and trying to have a kind of more managed positive outcome, which is interesting. I'm sure that we'll come back to all of this and we'll have a chance to kind of say where we agree and where we disagree. Rita, first, do you want to come in and answer the question, what do you hope for? Is there anything that hasn't been mentioned, or you can kind of respond to something that's come up already? Or maybe a question to ask you would be, are you an optimist or a pessimist? What do you want to add?
Well, thank you, Joe. I will reply to your question a bit differently, and I hope that you can see me as an optimist. But when I think about the post-pandemic world, the first thing that comes to my mind is the public health, because this has been a very discussed topic, and this has been a focus of all governments and the entire society in the past 2 years. So my first question here, or my first thought is like, how is it the public health going to be developed, or how are we going to ensure that we can better prevent, or we can be better prepared for another pandemic in the future, or for something that happens at the health level in the future? How are we preparing our societies to cope with this? And so I think the COVID was can bring us good answers, or can bring us good ideas on how we can prepare in the future. And I also think that we should be prepared in the future for such things that may arise. And I also see how the pharmaceutical area responded, and the industry responded to this COVID pandemic, and how the technology was developed at least fast enough to work with this pandemic. And I surely see this as a post-pandemic world. I surely think that many doors were open here to work on a higher level into new technologies for the health sector. And even then, when we can translate this into other sectors, I think there can be here an acceleration of the progression in the technology. And also, there should be here a shift in the government's action regarding public health. That's what we've seen these past few years. But then there's something that also comes to my mind when I think about the post-pandemic, which is the environmental issues, because it was something that for a while it was cut it, because we were focusing on the pandemic. And that now is arising again, and that now is a big focus. It's an emergency again. So that, I think that's something that it's coming for the post-pandemic world, definitely. And that's something that we need to act, because it's kind of an emergency in the next few years, and even more in the 2030s and 2040s. So that's actually that I would like to pin, and I would like to see some actions being done here at the governmental level and at the big scale for this. It's something that we know that we need the work both from the public sector and the private sector. One other thing that I see is here at the social level, that there was definitely a readaptation of the connections that we make with each other. And there is definitely here a big discussion about the connections that we now have more easily with other parts of the world, and the collaborations that can arise from there. And, this mental health of people, or this readjustment of society to a more digital, to a more virtual world. How is that going to impact the COVID generation? I think these were the main topics that arise here for this discussion.
Thank you, Rita. That's perfect. And let me try to kind of maybe link those together. You can tell me if this is a fool's errand, but I think the first point that you made was fascinating, about resilience, about how we can learn from the pandemic to, I'm using the word, you didn't use the word resilience, I'm bringing the word resilience in, but if I understand you, to make our societies more resilient to future shocks, to similar shocks, you, in your last point, you kind of highlighted a shock that we know is coming, which is climate change, right? So we know that we're going to have more extreme weather events, even if we stop burning fossil fuels now. it's kind of baked into the climate. So I think this might be, I mean, it's almost like this is a wake-up call. You know, this kind of shock is probably going to happen again and again. And one of the things that that happened at the end of the Cold War is there's a famous essay called The End of History by Francis Fukuyama, who sort of said, you know, the kind of market democracy model, the kind of, I suppose you could call it the neoliberal model, has kind of clearly outlasted all other systems. It's stable, and history can kind of end. You know, it's the end of revolutions, it's the end of pandemics, it's the end of kind of the wars and the plagues which we've had throughout human history. And we were talking about this, remember, we talked about Germany and the rise of Germany and transition. So the idea of the end of history is that's over. And it feels with the pandemic that history has started again. History is back. And it's, as you say, it's these shocks that we have to look out for. So building that resilience, I think, is really interesting. And the other thing you said that was fascinating is about technological cooperation. So I think this comes back to what both Karla and Diogo were saying. I mean, in terms of how these, if we talk about regional blocks and how kind of cooperation can happen, it is, and this came out of actually a previous panel that I moderated, which was, you can have a really complex relationship with different actors or different regions. You could, for example, be a rival with China in terms of security, or you could be a rival economically, but you could be there could be intense cooperation going on in science and technology, which is what happened with the vaccination, for example. It was cooperation between scientists that had, you know, the genome of the virus being sequenced very quickly, and then the multiple projects to develop vaccines and so on. So there can be complexity, not just in terms of the actors that Karla's talking about, but in terms of the ways that they cooperate and kind of work together, including, as you said, Rita, very interestingly, like, you know, civil society actors, or like, you know, these kind of collective movements that Karla's talking about, and the cooperation, that connectivity, or the opportunities for cooperation that connectivity perhaps offers them. So there's so much to talk about, and we're never going to be able to cover it all in like the next kind of 10 or 15 minutes, however long let's say 20 minutes that we're going to discuss this. So you guys have plenty that I'm sure you want to kind of bring up and respond to. I'll let you basically pick what we focus on, where we go. So I'm going to step back and just say, whoever wants to kind of respond to anything that's been said, please kind of step in. What of all of these different things we've identified, these questions that we could have about the world as we, you know, after the pandemic, the kind of post-pandemic world, which ones do you have something to add or something to say to? Karla, I see your hand up. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, well, I think the idea of the role of new and old actors in the international arena is really important, not only because that way we can understand who is setting the new rules, but also because it is obvious that we are perceiving the world from an anthropocenic perspective. And as Rita said, the environment is important as well, and we are just seeing it as something aside the world ruled by human. And then in this regard, I find really interesting that in Diogo is perceiving the European Union as a let's say less important actor in the future, while I am coming from a region where in regional integration is unreachable, basically. And we rely a lot in economic regionalism, and with just a couple of countries cooperating, instead of a region. We cannot think about Latin America as an actor, as a whole one, in several spheres as the European Union is. So in that way, from a perspective, I don't think the European Union is losing power. Just if you put it in front of China and the US, of course, that's different. But in the world, I think the European Union is a powerful actor who has a lot of things to do and say. And just quickly, in terms of the economic system that we have that is capitalist, and a lot of people are saying, yeah, this is the end of neoliberalism. Also, people say, oh, the end of globalization. I think we should be clear about these concepts and be really careful when we mention these kind of things, because no one is questioning if capitalism is ending. maybe the neoliberal model is declining. That's for sure. But that doesn't mean that it's ending, in my opinion. And I don't think globalization is ending at all, because with digitalization, actually, the connectivity is so much more higher than before. So just to people and to all of us, I recommend to be careful with what we think about these concepts that are really specific, important, and just don't use it randomly. So to end with this, I think the idea of different actors interacting in the present and also in the future is important to understand it, as well to put the human being not in the middle all the time. We should think as well in the environment and animals and all the whole world from different perspectives to understand it better and to do better in the future.
Thank you. No, I think these are all excellent points on kind of the end of capitalism and the end of neoliberalism. I think this is a really important point. I think to be more precise, I do mean neoliberalism. So, and I specifically mean the kind of market-led policies that became very popular in the post-industrial world from the 1970s onwards. So I'm specifically talking about a different role for the state, and we've seen this in the economic stimulus and the response from states to lockdowns, for example, in intervening in the job market to support employees, or in the stimulus in terms of the infrastructure spending or the Green New Deal. These kind of raise questions about the role of markets, the role of states, and I think that's a departure. It feels like a departure in the language we're using and the way that we're talking about the role of the state. So I think that you're right to be very clear, but I still think there's something there, which is, even with the clarity, I think it's still something very interesting to kind of point to. And second question, I have a question for you, maybe, Karla, before I hand over to the others. I thought your first point was really fascinating, this idea that this move towards regional integration that you're talking about might kickstart some of these kind of more formal processes of integration, like, for example, the Africa Union. There's a big African Union EU summit coming up, for example, which had sort of stalled, and which in some ways saw perhaps the European model as a kind of an approach, something that could maybe be kind of used or adopted in different regions. Do you think it's restarted that kind of conversation? Do you think we could see in some of these regional groupings greater transfer of sovereignty, of powers to more integration, more through the kind of the European model approach? Is that what you're saying?
Well, and I think the European Union is perceived as a model of success in terms of in regional integration. However, other regions or continents don't have the same perspective, and not all of them are looking forward to have the same model as the European Union does. However, it's a good example, yes, but I don't think all other countries or other regions can just adapt that model to their own realities, because all of them have different realities. So in that sense, yeah, it's really outstanding, but I don't know if it is that for everyone or for all the world.
Very clear. Now, Diogo, do you want to come in, because Karla was sort of responding to your pessimism about the demographic, the irrelevance of the growing irrelevance of Europe, and she was saying, maybe there's still some ways that Europe is going to be very relevant. So what would you say on this?
No. I mean, absolutely. Just to make it clear, I think so. Based on the old context I give and the figures, mainly like about economic growth and also demographics, I think those, and especially with also the response, just like trying to push a little bit like the public health issue as well here, I think those are really good opportunities for self-reflection. And I think for good self-reflection towards, here I'm mostly, I don't really want to center the attention on the EU but I think for every region, and especially if you're talking about multilateralism, and the EU is like the core example probably closer to each one of us now living in the EU, which is the case for us three and many people that are watching for sure, is that, you know, we still need to understand this as a challenge and as something that we will need to overcome to become better in a way, you know. So for sure, like I think actually if we think about the response to the whole pandemic and how the EU has structured like the response, and all the states have structured themselves to the response, I think we can actually think about a situation which had to do as well with the corona bonds, like all you know, which were needed for some states which were, you know, experiencing like you know, some states for sure were more influenced by the pandemic than others. So this was a really huge opportunity for them to also tackle the more structural issues that the pandemic was tackling in this case. And actually we saw some, you know, I'll probably use this word, but like some skepticism by some countries which were not that willing to cooperate in this whole corona bond system. And this is actually something triggering in a way. If we think about the European Union, and if we think about the good example that it should be in multilateralism, we see something so obvious such as the corona bonds, and when we see some countries, we are not willing to actually forego their economic interests for something bigger than that, you know. So I would probably see it as a challenge as well for us to think about. And yeah, I mean, this is just like an example, but there are other examples for sure in the EU. And if we think, and if we believe that there might be multilateralism in the future, as Joe was actually talking about, it's really interesting that, you know, history is actually building back, and we have this new opportunity of making things different. But it really should start for us to, you know, just acknowledge what we are having in the EU, like which can be also, you know, in the political spectrum, you know, the rising of far-right populistic movements, the migration crisis, the single currency, you know, all those issues are tackled, you know, in a multilateral way. And if we really want to solve them, we'll probably have to solve them in a multilateral way. And what we see is that these issues, you know, broadly speaking, have not been yet solved. You know, we still have countries that, for their ideologies, you know, we have the example of Poland, we have the example of Hungary as well. They are not, in a way, adhering to all the ideals of the EU as well. So these are just like few examples that actually make us question. But it doesn't mean that the EU is, you know, going to collapse per se, but we still need to like bear these issues in mind and see them as an opportunity to make things better. You know, if we really believe in regionalism, if we believe that it will be crucial for the world of tomorrow, then we really need to face this and try to make it better.
I think this is really interesting point, and it speaks to what Rita was saying earlier about building resilience, developing resilience, because what you said, Diogo, was, you know, this is there's many kind of challenges clearly, and that's the pandemic has presented us with you know, an overwhelming challenge in many ways, but it also is an opportunity to tackle some issues which were pre-existing, and climate change, of course, is one of those. So, for example, the stimulus spending, the economic stimulus spending, has often gone into promoting a transition to renewables, to kind of the kind of Green Deal approach in Europe and the United States, at least, and this is going to have an impact, in theory, on the way the world looks in 2030. If we look at things like energy independence and you know, the kind of the interdependencies between regions, I think if the EU starts kind of moving towards a circular economy, what does that mean for these questions of kind of globalism and globalization that we've been talking about, and interdependence? So Rita, maybe I could bring you in here, like, because to this, you had said, we need to tackle resilience. We need to kind of use this as an opportunity to try to become more resilient for the next shock, the next pandemic, whatever it is. And you'd also brought in climate change. Are you kind of hearing what Karla and Diogo have said? Are you sort of optimistic that that's being done with the Green Deal, with the kind of spending, the kind of Europe, next generation EU, and all of the kind of spending which is going? Do you think that we're building up that resilience and kind of meeting some of these kind of challenges when it comes to climate change, Europe as well, but also as a globally, because clearly climate change is a global question? Are you kind of optimistic on that front?
Well, I'm optimistic that we need this multilateralism and we need these relations in order to cope with this climate change and in order to create some positive impact and to work towards like this climate change that it's happening. But I also think that we need that from both the public sector and the private sector, and that's what mainly needs to be addressed here when it comes to climate change. When it comes to what Diogo was mentioning before, may we just like stop for a few seconds, because I would just like to ask you something, but I'm not like, I don't have like a big opinion on the matter, so I would like to ask you first.
Of course.
Not record it.
No, let me, I'm just going to write down a timestamp so that I can, okay, so that's fine. So we'll cut this.
Okay, because I just want to ask you, because you've been talking about how multilateralism, it's a good thing, and how we need these connections between like governments and between countries to reach some kind of impact in the future at both economic and even environmental level. But because I'm not very into this topic, but I just want to ask you for your opinion. We see some examples of how these how these collaborations or agreements between governments can have like a negative impact. We know that Russia has some conversations with the US, and we know that Ukraine is now almost in the edge of war, and it's being helped by Europe. So how can this multilateralism like be like, I know it can be positive, but it can also be negative. How do you see like this multilateralism being negative here? Because
is this a question to Diogo?
My question, because I'm not seeing it always as positive.
No, absolutely. Is this a question to me or to Diogo?
To the three of you. It's a topic because all of you have been talking about how multilateralism, it's a positive thing and it's a necessary thing, but from my low understanding on this, because I'm not very strong in this matter, I can see it has a bad thing sometimes. So I would like to know what you think in these specific cases. I don't know, some like this Israel war that it's happening for years.
No. I think multilateralism could be structured in a way to entrench inequalities or to, destabilize things. You could look at, for example, the system of alliances before the First World War. That was, maybe you could say that was a form. I mean, it was, I think it's multilateralism it's an approach. It just describes the relationship between actors, and I think you could have a bad multilateralism as well as a good multilateralism. You could have one that preserves an unjust order and keeps people, it keeps the peace, but at what cost? If it's an unjust peace, then that's, I would say, an unjust form of multilateralism. So I don't think it's automatically a good. I don't know what the others think. If you think, Karla, you've got your hand up.
Well, I think we are not discussing if it is positive or negative. But the thing is that multilateralism was established as the way the world will work after the Second World War. And now we are questioning if that system continues working, or why it is not working so well, or what is the future of that system that they told us was the good one to keep the democratic world going on. So in those terms, we are kind of speculating or based on the current reality, what's going on with that system that was established at that time. That is not maybe accurate anymore because we have different things now, a different crisis, different actors. So in that regard, I am not in a position of, this negative or positive, I am agree or disagree, but more like from a neutral perspective, just seeing it as an analyst of international relations, how is going on or how is the future of that kind of system, only that.
Yeah, so this is, as Karla says, this is the existing kind of multilateral system, which has gone through different revisions. It's not the first multilateral system or the first attempt to create a multilateral system. The League of Nations, for example, was an attempt to do something similar to what the United Nations does today, but it was not successful in preventing the Second World War. So there have been examples of multilateralism. Like literally all it means is that 3 or more states get together and through an alliance agree something. So you've had multilateralism since the beginning of time, right? But as Karla says, in very specific terms, when we talk about it today, we usually mean the United Nations, Bretton Woods institutions, the kind of multilateral post-war order. So I guess, but honestly, the purpose of this conversation is really just to get us thinking about these topics and to get kind of bounce ideas off each other and then see what questions come out at the end. So we're going to stop recording. I'm happy to keep this in, Rita, if you agree. We can cut it if you'd like, but I think I see this as part of the discussion and I would rather have this included. I mean, are you okay if we keep this in? I won't if you don't want to. We can cut it if you would prefer.
We can keep it in if you think it's relevant for discussion. I wasn't sure if it would be some kind of, like, if it would bring some kind of relevance for the questions or not.
No, I think it does. And I think I'll tell you why, because I think that you can have a discussion which is very kind of slick and produced and is a kind of, a panel discussion where we can't ask questions, but that shuts down the kind of conversation you can have. So I would just keep the camera running and have this discussion. And if we have questions, we're like, actually, are we using the same term? When, like Karla clarifying, for example, we have to be careful when we talk about capitalism versus neoliberalism. She's absolutely right, but have that discussion and have the space to kind of to discuss that with different people. Do we mean the same thing? What do we think the world should look like? What do we mean? What do we hope for? What are we worried about? So all of this, I think, is valuable. I would keep it all in because I love it. I think this discussion is really rich. And then the outcome is, which I've already gone through this with each of you in the kind of the speaker briefing, but just to the viewers, the outcome is then we're going to record some questions for this event, Friends of Europe event on the 24th of February on multilateralism, and hopefully get a response. So that for me, the value of this discussion, bouncing ideas, all sorts of things, is because, it might wobble something loose and you're like, actually, I want to ask about that. That's the thing I want to pick up on. So for me, that's a perfect question. I think this is, if you're comfortable keeping it, I'd be very happy to just keep it and not cut. Rita, it's up to you, but is it okay if we keep it in?
It's okay if we keep it in.
Good. I think it's better because otherwise it's too produced. It's like, the conversation has a kind of acceleration, and then it doesn't, I don't think, reflect some of these questions. You exclude that kind of question that you asked, which is a really important question. Like, do we mean the same thing? Are we all using the same terms? And what do we mean? And I skip over that. I should have maybe defined what I meant by multilateralism at the beginning. Look, I think we're coming to the end. I think I'm going to give maybe a last word to each of you, just if you want to say something very briefly, and then we'll record your questions. So let's go around. I've gone in this order throughout, so we'll do it again if it's okay. We'll start with Karla and then Diogo and then Rita. Like, final words. What are any final thoughts on this before we wrap up?
Okay, very briefly. I think multilateralism is not the same than 50 or 60 years ago. Now it's changing, and it is really interesting to see how it is changing and how actors, context, and other also people, how are they changing this multilateralism. And let's see if in the next years new projects could be done and then continue cooperating, collaborating, and coordinating projects internationally, because it's really important to keep the relationships not only in bilateral terms, but also interchange realities. Is really important to continue building the world for the better of everyone, and all the meaning as well, the environment in general.
Perfect. Diogo, what are your final thoughts?
Yeah, so I just like to just go back really quickly to what Rita was asking, because I didn't have the chance to actually reply to that. Is that, you know, I think as actually Karla was saying, like multilateralism is a concept, and you as well, Joe, like you're giving the context as well, the context. I think it's something that is, you know, just growing and changing, and like also the way it is implemented in the world, you know, to solve some issues. We have like different ways of like multilateralism, from, as you were saying, from like starting from the states to the organizations to all kinds of actors that, you know, and eventually this all lead to something. So I think it's actually something that we agree, both agree in, like, even if we don't, I don't know if we didn't like agree in a sense to the term of multilateralism, but we do agree that there should be cooperation, and the pandemic has shown that we need cooperation in the future. Yeah, you know, sadly this was a really short debate as well, because we could just look at the different topics. Karla was mentioning the environment, and I really reinforce that, you know, it's what actually Karla said, it's really built up, and it should be built up on society as well, and societal interests. And those interests are also from the youth. And I think, you know, we, generations of tomorrow, are also part of this whole solution. And yeah, basically my point, and we really focus on the EU as well, but it's just to give a clear and a more direct example of something we are actually experiencing every day, of how, you know, these struggles that, you know, an institution, a multilateral institution is facing, can actually lead us to reflect, you know, not only on what happened in the pandemic, but also what happened before the pandemic, and, you know, try to learn lessons from that. So essentially, I think it's something that, you know, all countries should also reflect, not only, you know, now I'm mentioning more countries, but like not only for themselves, but also their cooperations, their bilateral and finally multilateral relationships between all of them.
Perfect. And final word to Rita. You know, what are your thoughts on everything that's been said today? It was a really kind of dense conversation. We covered so much, but what kind of stands out? What are your final thoughts?
Okay, yeah, it was really interesting, and I really loved to speak with you and to get to meet you and know what you think about. There was a lot of topics here, and I feel like I focused more here on the climate change and environmental. And so I'd like to leave like a final question, or a final here sentence to think about, a final thought for us to give some ideas, because we've been talking about multilateralism, but we have seen also examples, like recent examples of COP26 or Paris Agreement. And are we maybe doing enough in these in these cooperations that we are doing for the results that we expect to obtain, or for what we need to prevent some kind of disaster, another pandemic in the world? Maybe now, the post-pandemic, is time to rethink a little bit, like everything that we've been discussing. Maybe some things are not enough. Maybe we need some disruptive, and we need to go out of the comfort zone and do some things, because we've seen that not always this multilateralism is working the way that we want it. And we are now questioning how we should change it, whether it should continue using or not. And so I would like to bring also these examples of these agreements that we see that they are not reaching like the results that we should be aiming at.
I think that's such an important final message, a kind of reality check. You know, are we doing enough? perhaps not, and what could we be doing better? That's a really excellent question. Please stay on the line, guys, because I'd like to just do a quick recording. So we'll do hopefully you've got some ideas for questions you want to ask, and we'll go to those. But for our viewers, we're going to say bye-bye. And we're going to say thank you for watching the debate. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it as rich and interesting as I did. I really enjoyed it a lot, actually. I know we covered a lot, but I thought it was fascinating. Thank you to everybody. Thank you to the panelists, and tune in for our next citizens panel in the not too distant future, I hope. And this will be published on the 24th of February, which should be today if you're watching this. So thank you very much. Please like and subscribe and all that stuff. And thank you all. Goodbye.